Welcome to today's SQL interview preparation session. In this presentation, we are going to cover two very important and commonly used SQL interview questions. The first question asks us to write an SQL query to find duplicate email addresses in a customer's table. The second question explores the difference between two powerful SQL concepts, partition by and group by. Both of these topics test your practical SQL skills and your understanding of how data is grouped, aggregated, and analyzed. So let's get into it. Finding duplicate emails. Let's start with the first question. How do you find duplicate email addresses in a customer's table using SQL? This is a very practical problem that data professionals encounter regularly. For example, when cleaning a customer database to remove redundant records or identify data entry errors, the solution uses two very important SQL clauses working together, group by and having. Let's walk through the query step by step. We write select email count all as count from customers group by email having count all greater than 1. Now, let's understand exactly what each part of this query is doing. The group by email clause is the first key step. It scans through where every row in the customers table and groups together all rows that share the same email address. So if the email john@example.com appears 3 times in the table, all 3 rows are placed into one group. Each unique email address becomes its own group. Once the rows are grouped, the count all function counts how many rows exist in each group. In other words, how many times each email address appears in the table. We give this count a readable name using the S keyword, calling it simply count. Now here comes the most important part, the having clause. You might wonder why use having instead of where. This is actually a very common interview question in itself. The reason is that where filter individual rows before grouping happens. So it cannot be used with aggregate functions like count. Having, on the other hand, filters after the grouping and aggregation is complete, which means it can evaluate the result of count. So by writing having count greater than 1, we are telling SQL to only return those email groups where the count is greater than 1, meaning the email address appears more than once in the table, making it a duplicate. The final result shows you exactly which email addresses are duplicated and how many times each one appears. This is a clean, efficient, and widely used approach for duplicate detection in SQL. Now, let's move on to our second question, which is one of the most frequently asked advanced SQL interview questions. What is the difference between partition by and group by in SQL? Both of these clauses are used to divide data into groups for analysis, but they work in fundamentally different ways and serve very different purposes. Understanding this distinction clearly will definitely impress your interviewer. Partition by versus group by explained. Let's break down the core difference between group by and partition by in a clear and structured way. Starting with group by, when you use group by in a SQL query, it takes all the rows in your table and collapses them into groups based on the column or columns you specify. For each group, it returns exactly one summarized row. This means the individual row level details are lost. You only see the aggregated result for each group. For example, consider the query select department average salary from employees group by department. Here, the output will have one row per department, showing the average salary for that department. You will not see individual employee names or their individual salaries. Those details are collapsed away. Group by is perfect when you want a summary or a high level overview of your data and you don't need to preserve the individual records. Now let's talk about partition by, which is a completely different beast. Partition by is used as part of window functions in SQL. Functions that perform calculations across a set of rows that are related to the current row. The critical difference is that partition by does not collapse your rows. Every single row in your table is preserved in the output. What partition by does is logically divide the data into partitions or groups behind the scenes. Perform the calculation within each partition and then attach the result of that calculation back to every individual row. Consider this query. Select name, department, average salary over partition by department from employees. The output here will show every single employee, their name, their department, and the average salary of their department sitting right next to them in the same row. So you get both the detailed row level information and the aggregated calculation at the same time in a single result set. To summarize the difference in the simplest possible terms, group by reduces your data. It gives you one output row per group, collapsing all the individual details. Partition by enriches your data. It keeps every row intact and adds a calculated value alongside each row based on the partition it belongs to. Use group by when you want a summarized report. Use partition by with window functions when you want to perform calculations across groups while still keeping all the original rows and their details visible in the output. This distinction is extremely powerful in real world data analysis. For instance, if you want to compare each employee's salary against the average salary of their department without losing any employee records, partition by is the only tool that can do that elegantly and efficiently in a single SQL query. Thank you.